Hey, good morning again. This is Justin Weber, Tuesday's Devotions with Justin, and KD Burkett is behind the camera. We're ready to do our fifth installment of Tuesday Devotions with Justin. Sorry about that. Today I'm going to look at a really wonderful chapter in the Gospel of John, John chapter 9, and it's a wonderful story full of irony and sarcasm. And also, I think, a truth that we can grab a hold of and say, it's all right to have questions and to be interrogated by ourselves and by other people about our faith. The story goes like this. As a man is born blind, his disciples ask, Rabbi, teacher, did this man or his parents sin that he was born blind? And Jesus says, neither. This has happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. And we're going to find out what the work of God is. It's very simple. The work of God is to believe in Jesus. That's how the Gospel of John ends. And this is what happens to the man that's born blind. Now, one of the interesting things about this story is that after he says that Jesus is the light of the world, he takes spit on the ground and he makes some mud with his saliva and he puts it on the blind man's eyes. Now, what is interesting about this is that a somewhat of a contemporary of Jesus, whose name was Philo of Alexandria, Egypt, he writes that it was believed in those days, in that ancient time, in that period, that the saliva of holy men had healing power. And so Jesus employs the healing method of his day. It would be like us going to the emergency room or the hospital. Jesus used the contemporary ways of healing in this story to bring about sight to this man born blind. Now, what's really interesting about this story is that word gets out that the one that was blind can now see. And so the first thing that happens is the neighbors show up. Of course, we know this, especially in rural America. Something happens and the neighbors show up. And so they go, well, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? No, it only looks like him. And then the blind man says himself, who was once blind, I am the man. And they ask, how were your eyes opened? Now he says, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to the pool of Siloam, which means sent, and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Now remember, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is the one sent by God to take away the sins of the world. So there's a wonderful wordplay going on here. But what's interesting is that at the first interrogation by the neighbors, the blind man says, the man they call Jesus. Later, a group of Pharisees hear about this, the religious authorities. And so the neighbors bring the Pharisees in on this miraculous event. And they said, how did this happen? And he tells the story again. Jesus made mud and opened my eyes. And it was on the Sabbath. And they said, well, this man can't be from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? Good question. How can a sinner perform such miracles that his eyes were opened? And then the man that was born blind said to the Pharisees, he is a prophet. In the first interrogation, he says, the man they called Jesus. In the second interrogation, the man born blind says he is a prophet. Well, then now there's a second interrogation by the Pharisees. They are interrogating and questioning the man who's born blind. They're questioning his parents now. We know he's your son, and we know he was born blind, but how can he see how his eyes were open? And they said, hey, he's grown up. You ask him himself. And so they go back for a third interrogation of the man born blind. And they summoned the man and said, give glory to God by telling the truth. And they said, whether he's a sinner or not, the man born blind says, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. But one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. They asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered, I have already told you, but you did not listen. Now here is pure Johannine sarcasm and irony. Why, the blind man says to the Pharisees, why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Well, that's pure sarcasm. Then they hurled the insults at him. You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And that's the irony of John. Remember, Jesus is the one sent by God, who sent the blind man to the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And then the blind man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. If he listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And to this the Pharisees said, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Now this is an interesting phrase. They threw him out. In the early 90s of the first century, after the temple had been destroyed, Pharisaical Judaism wrote these 18 benedictions, and one of them is that if anyone claims the Christ, anyone that follows the Messiah, has to be cast out of the synagogue. And this is probably what this story is referring to, is that this person has come to faith in the synagogue, in the Jewish religious organization, and is now proclaiming that Jesus is a prophet, and they throw him out of the synagogue. Now, what is interesting, the man who was once blind is now thrown out of the synagogue. And Jesus hears. That's interesting. Jesus hears that he's thrown out, and Jesus finds him and asks this question, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The once blind man asks. Tell me, so that I may believe in him. And Jesus answered, you have seen him. He is the one speaking with you. And then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Now, one of the things I want us to really grab a hold of here is that this man wasn't even certain who Jesus was as he got his sight. He calls him the man they called Jesus, way up in verse 10. And then after the first interrogation, he refers to Jesus as a prophet. And then after his parents, and he's been interrogated a third time by the Pharisees, and after he's kicked out of the synagogue, it's only then he comes to clarity. That full sight comes to his heart and his mind, and he goes, Lord, I believe. And one of the things I want us to take home is that God is never concerned about our questions. God is bigger than our questions. He wants us to question. He wants us to be curious. He wants us to have a faith that has texture and depth and asks the hard questions so that we can stand up in times of difficulty and persecution and trials that come just through life. We have to have that kind of deep faith like the man who was born blind. He got to that revelation about who Jesus was by being questioned. And I think that is a wonderful lesson for us today. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave it with you. That's enough to think about, that through insightful interrogation, the man gains his sight. And that is something for us to chew on for the rest of our lives as we follow this person, Jesus, who some of us believe is a man, who some believe is just a prophet, and others who believe he's the Lord. Whatever stage you're in, it's okay, because God's big enough and loves us enough to hold us and let us have our questions. May the Lord bless you, and may you have a great week of ministry in the name and the character of Jesus, the one who gives sight to those of us who have been blind. Amen.